Speaker profiles in here, so I don't want to say too much that's redundant. But Alexandra Hiropoulos came to our campus just now your second year.
Second year.
Seems like a long time ago that I met you. When I met her as a candidate, I was really deeply intrigued by the research work that she's been conducting down in South Africa. And I was happy that she was able to maintain her affiliation with the group there that she has organized a lot of her research with. She's going to speak to us today. The theme is xenophobia and violence against those who are other and different.
I just have a PowerPoint that I'll be showing you as well. Thank you, everybody. So, as Dean Torredio said, I will be talking to you today about xenophobic violence in South Africa and more broadly about how human rights apply to migrants and others in South Africa. But before I get to that, I'll give you a brief introduction about myself. I have been researching violence in South Africa for about 10 years now. I originally went to conduct research on sexual violence. My background was in sexual violence. I used to work with the British government and crime intelligence, specifically on sexual violence, serial sexual assaults and sexual homicide. Sexual assaults occur frequently in South Africa, so I went to do some research there. And while I was there, I started reading reports in the news that there were large-scale threats against people in the country, that if migrants didn't leave by the end of that summer, which was winter in South Africa, then they would be violently expelled from the country by members of the public. So that really got me really interested in this topic, and that led to my doctoral dissertation then focusing on xenophobic violence. It led to postdoctoral work in South Africa at the African Center for Migration and Society, where I was living in Johannesburg for a few years before I moved here to Turlock, and I joined the Faculty of Criminal Justice here at Stan State. So I'll be talking to you, like I said, about how human rights apply to asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants in South Africa. Collectively, I will be referring to them as non-nationals, and when I refer to a particular group, I will specify. But before I can tell you about the experiences of non-nationals in South Africa, let's talk about who they are first. Who are the migrants going to South Africa? Because the picture is very different nowadays than it was before the end of apartheid in 1994. So the big question is, firstly, how many migrants are in South Africa? And this is a big question nationally within the country because even though South Africa has this long history of cross-border migration from surrounding countries, even from the discovery of minerals, long-distance migration for employment predates the drawing of international borders by colonial powers in the 1800s in South Africa. We do hear very frequently, we do question how many international migrants are in South Africa because we have very bad data on how many there actually are. It's very difficult in South Africa to measure the extent of domestic and international migration, and domestic migration is extreme. It far outnumbers international migration, actually. There's poor data on the South African population itself, and due to large-scale migrations in and out of the country, it's hard to really see how many there are. However, we very frequently, hear exaggerated estimates of the number of migrants in South Africa. Public officials, high-level members of the government, even a judge from the Constitutional Court that I met in New York and spoke to, quoted that there are 8 to 10 million migrants in South Africa. Absolutely not. That is a gross overgeneralization. Realistic figures based on triangulation of various data sets, mostly from the South African census, are that there are only about 2 to 3 million migrants in the country, and that's overall about 4% of the total population of the country. So there are 2 to 3 million migrants, but overall there are about 55 million people in the country. So if you think about it, it's not a huge number of migrants that are in the country. It has hugely increased, though. The levels of migration have hugely increased post-apartheid, and it's different, which I'll talk to you about in a couple bullet points. So what are the changes in migration that we're seeing nowadays? Firstly, we're seeing that the biggest difference is who's coming. European migration dominated until the end of apartheid. Soon after, that greatly changed. Most migrants nowadays come from the African continent and from Asia, by far. And also, they're demographically different. Many, many more women are migrating nowadays internationally. Many more children are also found to be migrating internationally as well, and migrants are a lot younger than they used to be in South Africa, especially. However, I don't know why I'm having such difficulty with this clicker. It's very simple. We frequently hear comments from public officials in South Africa that scapegoat migrants. Very frequently, even the head of the South African Police Service, unfortunately, frequently makes comments over the past year blaming the increase in crime in South Africa on non-nationals. The South African police don't actually release the crime statistics giving you actually the race or ethnicity of the perpetrators, so we can't look at official statistics to actually verify that or not, but it is highly, extremely unlikely that it's migrants that have led to the increase in violent crime in South Africa, mostly due to the low levels of overall in the population that they currently have. So, and to give you a little more context, overall there are high levels of xenophobic sentiment in the country. Surveys have been showing for over 10 years, regardless of socioeconomic status, people don't want migrants coming in to the country. Frequently, migrants are blamed for stealing jobs from South Africans. They're blamed for stealing women from South Africans. And most of the time nowadays, we know that migrants are coming, like I said, from Africa, especially from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Somalia, Rwanda, and the Congo. This is an image that you frequently see in South Africa. It's in a lot of papers, it comes up all the time, and it's referring to the cross-border migration, especially from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's economy collapsed somewhat recently, and that led to an influx of migration into South Africa, which has led to increased xenophobic sentiment. Migrants crossing over from Zimbabwe, like I said, they're leaving a country with a collapsed economy, a severe lack of jobs, hyperinflation, and human rights violations. When migrants are also crossing this Limpopo River, this is on the northern part of the country, the South Africa borders Zimbabwe, and this is the Limpopo River. So this river is actually populated by crocodiles. So people crossing the border are actually frequently attacked by crocodiles, and especially women are frequently sexually assaulted on the way to South Africa. So that's the context overall that I'm giving you, but let's talk about the legal framework now with regards to what rights actually apply to non-nationals in South Africa. Well, South Africa's constitutional guarantees of basic rights are actually amongst the most expansive and progressive in the world. It includes a lot of language from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And the 1996 Constitution's Bill of Rights gives all persons, including documented and undocumented people, as well as citizens, fundamental and procedural protections. And it expansively delineates the rights of immigrants, protecting them from unconstitutional conduct and human rights violations. So these rights include the right to life, the right to dignity, equality before the law, administrative justice, basic education and healthcare, and labor rights. There are further procedural rights delineated in the 2002 Immigration Act and the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act that South Africa passed, and South Africa has also signed on to a number of international treaties. The 1998 Refugees Act very specifically details the rights of asylum seekers and refugees. It includes language from the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees. There's also regional legislation like the 2007 SADC, the Southern African Development Community Protocol on the Facilitation of Movement of Persons. Despite this extensive legal framework, however, migrants are remarkably vulnerable to exclusion and victimization within the country. They're also frequently victims of corruption and harassment from police and immigration officials, and violence and intimidation by government officials as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about immigration enforcement. So the Department of Home Affairs is the department that regulates migration for the country. We can say that they are similar to the Department of Homeland Security's ICE here in the US, but it's not as big as a deportation machine as we have here in the United States. The 2002 Immigration Act that I referred to earlier, it regulates immigration by enabling permits for skilled migrants, students, and tourists. When I was in the skilled migration in South Africa is actually very heavily regulated. I was a skilled migrant in South Africa. I had very serious limitations to what I could do in the country and how long I could stay. Now, this legislation, the 2002 Immigration Act, is still in place today. It retains the strong security and sovereignty-centered agenda of the Alien Controls Act, which was the immigration legislation that the apartheid government had. South Africa continued on with that act until 2002, actually, so from 1994 to 2002. And admittedly, the country and the government had a lot of other issues to deal with. This was the first transition to democracy. If you think about it, just the police alone, transitioning the police to be a democratic police force was a major task. And the South African government has done some great things. It's built thousands of homes for poor people, on things that would be unheard of here in South Africa. However, how they're handling migration is a different story that I'm telling you about today. So the Immigration Act that they still have is influenced by the dominant themes of security, border control, and the use of law enforcement to regulate migration that we see from the West. So very much influenced by what we see in the United States and Europe. There are also current changes in this legislation. So the South African government is trying to change the 2002 Immigration Act, and essentially they're making it impossible to receive citizenship and even permanent resident status within the country. I last year conducted a review for policing for APCOF. It's called the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. And I reviewed the applicability of the legal framework with regards to the arrest and detention of migrants in South Africa. So I'm quoting from this review to tell you a little bit about with respect to arrest and deportations. Very frequently we see the violation of rights to human dignity and equality, and the violation of procedural rights when it comes to non-nationals. With regards to detention, these images are from it's called the Lindela Repatriation Center. It's a deportation center. It's on the northern side of the country, on the border with Zimbabwe in Musina, and we frequently see violation of rights here, the rights to be free from violence, torture, cruel, and inhumane and unusual punishment while in detention. We see the increased marginalization of migrants in South Africa as well. Even though they have these extensive rights that I referred to, they frequently experience difficulty or are overtly excluded from access to things like government services, access to employment, access to justice, and they experience ongoing victimization, which I will tell you a lot about right now. So this image is from some very famous xenophobic attacks that occurred in 2008. This issue was only started to be taken seriously, or the issue of xenophobia and xenophobic violence started gaining attention in 1998, both in the country and around the world, because of these large-scale attacks that occurred. And these began with an isolated incident in Alexandra Township, which is out in Johannesburg in South Africa, and it spread to townships in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban, and it led to the death of over 41 foreign nationals, about over 1,000 people wounded, dozens of women that we know of that were raped. It's probably hundreds, if not more. At least 100,000 people were displaced, and property worth millions of South African rand was looted, destroyed, or seized by local residents and leaders in these 2008 attacks. And this is from one of the informal settlements outside Johannesburg. Now, it's important to note here that xenophobic violence is actually, and the word xenophobia itself is a contentious issue in South Africa. The South African government formally doesn't acknowledge that xenophobia exists, so anti-foreigner sentiment. So xenophobia is a sense of sort of dislike or fear against people deemed as others, and that can be based on your race or ethnicity, like we're seeing with xenophobic violence, but it could be also sexual orientation, religion, and other things like that. Now, to the South African government, which if you think about it, all the major anti-apartheid activists are still members and a part of the current government, the African National Congress. All of these people were activists. All of these people also were given safe haven in neighboring countries when they were doing it, when they were engaging in the activist behavior. They were exiled many times in other countries. So it's very contentious, and it's a sensitive and touchy subject to the South African government to have to sort of admit that even though this recent history of this cross-border collaboration and this philosophy of Ubuntu, as it's known in Africa, the fact that so many people are being victimized in South Africa that are coming from those neighboring nations like Zimbabwe, which did aid South Africa a lot, is politically contentious. And I'll give you some more info on that, on how difficult it is to work on this large project that I am under that context. So this is a response that the UN had to engage in 2008 after the large-scale attacks. It's since then had to intervene multiple times because the attacks have not stopped. We did see the 2008 attacks were the largest that have occurred. However, we know that indiscriminate mob violence continues, which I'll talk about now. And the reason why we created this project, Xenowatch, which I'll tell you about, was because we didn't know in South Africa much about where the attacks against foreign nationals were occurring across the country. And we knew that especially civil society responses to these attacks were limited due to a lack of information. So we received initially about, the conversion rates differ, I think around $180,000 initially from Freedom House to launch Xenowatch, and recently received about $80,000 more from the Open Society Foundation of Southern Africa. So we launched in 2015, and we continue this work today. So what is Xenowatch? It's a national open access platform and research project which collates and visualizes data on xenophobia-related incidents collected through many sources. So I'll tell you firstly how people report. So it's, like we said, it's open source platform. So people can report across the country sending a free text message to the number 44161. People can email from across the country or anywhere in the world, and can also report on a special website that we've created called Xenowatch. We also have an extensive now list of partner organizations which we collaborate with. It's really important now, like I said, xenophobic violence is a contentious issue. So if I'm going to go out and make media statements and write reports like this and work on a very large project like Xenowatch, which, as you saw, has some significant partners. UNHCR is our partner, the South African Local Government Association is our partner. It's based at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. and a lot of other verification partners that I'll tell you about now, we have to verify, we have to triangulate, we have to be very sure about what statements we're making and what we're releasing to the public. So what we do is when we get a report of an incident occurring, we call our list of partners across the country in that location. So we get information on the exact location, and we also get longitude and latitude info so that we can get spatial information and map it out, as I'll show you in a couple slides. So then we send members of our research team to that location to conduct interviews, especially though after we deem that it's safe for one of our team to enter that area. We also work with big organizations in the country, like the Institute for Security Studies, the UNHCR Helpline shares with us, and we help share with them. Other UN organizations like the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the United Nations Development Program, and UNICEF. A major organization for migrants and refugees in South Africa, which is CORMSA, Lawyers for Human Rights, international organizations like the IOM and Amnesty International also share with us, but from my experience, it's been more us sharing with them, and also media reports as well. So why did we create XenoWatch? What are we trying to do with this? Well, for one, very much helps with improved data collection and quality. I started off by saying that we knew very little about this issue. We've put together a rapid response network that includes verification of incidents. We also are trying to enhance collaboration with government and civil society partners. We also want to strengthen the government's ability to respond. So what we did is we created this early warning system, where when we confirm an incident and verify an incident through our process, then we immediately forward that to the South African Police Service so that they can hopefully respond immediately as well. And then we also take all relevant reports that are verified, then anonymized and recorded, and we post them on our website to increase greater public awareness on safety and inclusion. Our website's xenowatch.ac.ca if anyone wants to have a look. And it includes verified data and analysis that are available to the public. It also has some interesting sort of user-friendly things as well, like we've input the data set onto the website so then users are able to sort of map out and also graph incidents based on a particular timeline that they're interested in or a different location that they're interested in. My research further examines the determinants of xenophobic violence. This is what my doctoral dissertation research focused on, and a lot of the work that I do nowadays. So I look at things like levels of crime in areas, population density, unemployment levels, education levels, housing conditions, in order to better inform conflict prevention initiatives. So what are we finding so far? We're finding that there are ongoing patterns of crimes and violence that target foreigners or others in South Africa that we'll talk more about shortly. Attacks take many forms in South Africa. So I refer to those large-scale attacks of hundreds and thousands of people getting together in areas, but we see mob violence as well. We see intimidation through posters, through group WhatsApp text messages that reach thousands of people actually across the country with threats to foreigners that you must leave now. Vocal threats in areas and looting campaigns, unfortunately, frequently targeting foreign-owned businesses or residences, and sometimes targeted murder. So this data set that we put together is also noteworthy, like I said, because it also includes spatialized data. So we're able to map out what we're seeing, and we're also conducting, at least me, spatial and statistical analysis on this as well. So this shows you the entire country, you see. So the South Africa borders with Zimbabwe above to the right. To the far right is actually Mozambique. Then you see Botswana and Namibia. So these are the neighboring countries. And the dots are simply frequencies of attacks that have occurred throughout the country. We have about 500 incidents so far in this data set. So these are just frequencies, but nowadays, especially with easy access to mapping software, you can conduct spatial analysis that can give you some more better info. So this is a heat map, actually. And what it does is it displays incidents of violence, of xenophobic violence, as colors. So you see in the center, so within the borders of the country, the red areas are those that are actually hotspots of xenophobic violence. Another map here I'll show you. This is now the northern border of the country. Highlighted at the top is Musina, where the Lindela deportation center is placed, and it's there frequently where people cross the border. And you see frequencies of attacks in this northern part of the country, and importantly, this is Gauteng. So Gauteng is one of South Africa's 7 provinces. It's the smallest, but it's the most important. It's one of the administrative capitals of the country. Government sits here, parliament sits here, the courts sit here. Johannesburg is in the province of Gauteng as well, and Pretoria. So these are some frequencies of attacks. So as you see these dots, so these just show where individual attacks occur, but conducting spatial analysis, you can see hotspots. And looking at these hotspots and zooming in even further than this, you can start to conduct other analysis and look at unemployment levels in that particular area, and a lot of different things if you have access to that data. And in the hopes that conflict prevention initiatives will be better informed. And already, for example, we've advised the city of Johannesburg which particular areas to target for some social cohesion campaigns that they were involved in. These are some frequencies from the Western Cape, sort of second most important province in South Africa. Cape Town is located in this province, absolutely beautiful part of the world. And I say this as a snobby Greek person who grew up in beautiful Greece. South Africa is absolutely amazing and beautiful, and especially the Western Cape. You see here, though, from the frequencies, we can delineate the hotspots of xenophobic violence. And the areas that are highlighted here in red are actually the townships of Kayelitsa, Nyanga, and Philippi. And these areas are areas with a lot of diversity. They're all townships, which means people live mostly in informal settlements, high rates of unemployment, high rates of poverty, and a lot of violent crime in general in these areas. And another sort of software program that you can use to visualize hotspots as an example is this one, where now you can see now the differences in different ward districts a little more clearly in this one. So what have we learned so far? So XenoWatch only launched in 2016. What are we seeing? We're seeing that victims are South African and foreigners. These are people who are generally deemed as outsiders. So you don't have to actually be a foreigner to be a victim of xenophobic violence. Okay? Many times South Africans are attacked because, for example, they're renting their home or their business to a non-national, to a non-citizen of South Africa. Many times South Africans are attacked if they come from a different part of the country. Like I said earlier on, domestic migration is huge in South Africa. People move within the country to a very, very large extent. Now, depending on where you come from and your the tone of your skin and your accent, you can be victimized, and we have seen this occurring. We know that xenophobic violence occurs in all provinces and all types of locations across the country as well, although most are occurring in these townships that I referred to. We know that both women and men are perpetrators and victims. We know that there are a great many sexual assaults involved. Few are ever reported to the police, and almost none are ever prosecuted. Out of the murders of non-nationals in South Africa, and overall I think we've counted a few hundred, there's only been one prosecution so far since 1994 of a murder of a non-national in South Africa. We know that there's no single cause. We can't say that there's one reason why this is occurring. A lot of factors are involved. My research shows it many times associated with socioeconomic marginalization, heterogeneity in the area, proximity to high violence areas, and very frequently and importantly, we have to point out that it's closely tied to local politics and histories. Many times in areas, we find that it's a local council person, usually a councilman, who's behind the attack, who instigates the attack in many reasons. And unfortunately, there's no indication that anti-foreigner violence or xenophobic violence is decreasing in the country. So going back to rights now. What are we seeing with regards to court rulings in South Africa? For one, we know and we see courts consistently rule in favor of migrants' rights within the country. For example, the North Gauteng High Court criticized the practice of arresting and detaining asylum seekers without verifying their status or allowing access to the refugee system. The High Court also criticized the Department of Home Affairs for undue delays in issuing documents under the Refugees Act, the practice of keeping asylum seekers in immigration detention pending the outcome of applications, and then rearresting their detainees upon release. And that makes it possible to get around the 30-day limit of detention without a warrant under the Immigration Act. The court openly held these practices unlawful and inconsistent with the South African Constitution. Again, the Supreme Court of Appeals in Abdi v. Minister of Home Affairs. The court chastised the Department of Home Affairs for its failures to respect individual rights and for putting forth false legal arguments, and suggested that the Department of Home Affairs did not show sufficient respect for the judicial process. Research continues to point out, for example, the continued violation, especially of procedural rights with regards to the arrest and detention of migrants, but we very frequently see the continuation, the frequent use of bribery by the Department of Home Affairs officials, and this just builds on and it adds to the common perception that asylum in South Africa is just bought, so the whole asylum system is delegitimized, and few institutions, social services, and employers recognize refugee or asylum papers. So moving forward. We've created all these great legal frameworks. South Africa especially is hailed across the world for its progressive constitution, for its democratic transition. We do see, however, that the African National Congress, the government, appears unwilling to enforce the laws in this respect. The immigration regime in South Africa has been criticized for not adapting to national and regional needs and not providing adequate access to documented migration options in ways which address South Africa's labor needs, South Africa's serious labor needs. The contemporary framework also, I referred to earlier, how currently the government is trying in South Africa, but we see this, unfortunately, all around the world today, moving towards further restricting migrants' rights. So how can we respond to the non-enforcement of the law? So far, we see that the courts are the ones responding. Courts are ruling in favor. Courts put certain limitations and rules to be enforced afterwards. And unfortunately, I don't have the answer. And I'm going to finish this presentation with a question. And the question is, can the courts continue to do this heavy lifting? They are doing the heavy lifting. Can they continue to do this? And is this something that we can simply sort of expect from the law, because clearly our legal frameworks aren't working and they're not enough? And I have left about 9 minutes for questions.
Dr. Hiropoulos, thank you so much for this very enlightening presentation. This is a critical subject for the future of the entire African continent because of the importance of South Africa. And I really hope that you continue to do your work. And in so doing, I would also like to add that maybe your target or the people whose mind you may want to change, no matter how small, in the future will actually be South African leaders and the government at all levels, local and national. I would just like to add 4 dimensions of this so that our audience understands, I think, better. The history of the xenophobia, when you cross-check it with the history of sexual violence in South Africa, is actually part and parcel of the same history. There is an extraordinary, terrible, and depressing view of the woman in South African culture, in both black and white society. There is actually a quote from former President Botha, one of the last apartheid head of state, who was heard saying that, talking about the sexual shape of an African woman from her behind will be tantamount to legitimizing an abuse of physical thrust into her, something that he said in Afrikaner language, which was very violent. And also go of the history of a prominent African woman who was taken to Europe in zoo and was portrayed because of her own feminine particularities. So when it comes to violence, I think that what Mandela and the ANC did was to succeed in defeating apartheid as a political tool of governance. But what they haven't succeeded yet, that is still work to do, and which may explain this, is the social and economic dimension. As a Cameroonian, I once traveled to South Africa, and I was told that I cannot even transit through the country with my Cameroon passport because I had to spend the night in the hotel at the airport. And yet, Cameroon is one of the countries that consider themselves as a frontline state country when African countries were fighting against the apartheid regime. And my country, my passport, I could travel all over the world, but Cameroonians were forbidden by law to ever travel to South Africa. So the African countries paid a very heavy price, and you're quite right to mention that because all the African nations are taken aback when their citizens are attacked in South Africa. And frontline states, Mozambique, geographically frontline states, because Nigeria, for instance, whose citizens are sometimes attacked, is not a geographical frontline, but Nigeria was at the forefront of the fight. But frontline states like Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and others, they really suffered a lot because during the civil war in Angola, for instance, the South Africans will show their military superiority by flying Mirage jets and supporting UNITA and creating a lot of violence in those countries. They bombarded Namibia, you had massacres all over the border, they supported UNITA, they tried to kill Mozambican and South African leaders in Maputo, downtown. So the people in those frontline states have a knowledge, they believe that South Africa was powerful, was technologically advanced, was economically important. And the South Africans who were themselves punished under apartheid ended up believing so. They were told that they are far advanced compared to the other African states. One of the narratives of the apartheid regime was to say, look at these other African countries. You have to leave us in power, we, the white power, simply because we do it better. We are advanced, we have airports, we have military aircraft, and look at the other African countries, they cannot do it. So the problem here is that the ANC and the others who took power still have a long way to go in educating themselves, in creating and educating a civil society and a working class that will come to understand the rights of the others, that will come to understand that South Africa is actually indebted to these other African countries that suffer a lot. Not to take too much time, let me just add finally a cultural observation. In old culture, the South Africans have always been afraid that somebody will come from outside and through marriage or through birth will take over South Africa. It happened with Shaka Zulu, and it happened even recently with Nelson Mandela, who married the widow of Samora Machel. And all the Shanghai people will tell you the story. And culturally, the South Africans are very much afraid of people from Swaziland. Some of them speak the same language. They are afraid of Mozambicans. They are afraid of people from Zimbabwe. And yet, these are the people who sacrifice so much from South Africa. And the South Africans today, culturally, need so much education. And you do not have yet a sufficiently solid class of people in the ruling system that will actually understand what migration is. And so it's so complex, and you can defeat apartheid, but if you actually do not defeat the deep causes, the deep roots of apartheid, you'll have what you have today. I have a son who is now based in South Africa, who just moved from London to Cape Town, and I am afraid to say that the world may somehow be surprised if tomorrow you have a major conflagration in South Africa, because there are so many issues, but it takes really a well-educated class to do that. They are very much victims of their own history, and on the internal migration of South Africans themselves, I would say that this was the result of the apartheid regime trying to satisfy the extractive industry, mainly gold and diamond, because people should know that Soweto is an acronym of Southwest Township. You had Norweto. So these dormitories, these shanty towns, were established here or there because it was a decision, it was not normal. So mob violence is just normal because people were gathered like cattle in various places, in a place that is so artificial. South Africa is an artificial formation. It still has to work hard on the formation of governance and a state that considers everybody as citizens, and that is a fundamental problem.
Thank you so much for those comments and the important context that you added, because you are very right in everything that you said. And unfortunately, what I can add is that absolutely the South African government and members of the public have to be better informed. And there are high levels of xenophobia that we're seeing, but unfortunately what we're seeing, and part of the reason why we created Xenolaunch, is because the government responses are so inadequate and they remain inadequate. And what we're seeing right now is no real effort from the South African government to address these issues. And I was surprised to see, it was actually just this week, that the new president, Hiropoulos, who there's a lot of optimism about, is continuing this new harsh immigration act that they want to pass, which is very problematic. So yes, there is a long ways to go, and I will continue this project for many years and this research, but you are very right, unfortunately. Go ahead.
I want to wear the hat of an African elderly person, okay, who has seen colonialism and post-colonial practices. That during colonialism, the Asians in East Africa were superimposed. They became the economic elites of the society. They came Idi Amin. And what about Rhodesia and all these other places? As an old African, I have seen maybe the South Africans are saying to themselves, that if we allow these new people to come in, they are going to bring in another type of apartheid in South Africa that will be difficult to deal with. If you look at West Africa, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, etc., who are the economic elites there? These are foreigners. It's hard to get them out. We have the political power, and they got the economic power. So who really is in charge? It's not the indigenous people, but it is the foreigners that have the economic power. What do you say to this? As I listen to you, as an elderly African, this is what I get.
What do I say to the fact that, well, it's an important point that you raise. And I noticed that for the first time simply when I was visiting South Africa for Cape Town, specifically the first time I went to the seaside, very affluent area, and there was a lot of building going on the seaside and in Cape Town, and I started asking, like, well, who's doing all this building? And the answer was foreigners, actually, foreign nationals. And this is something that we see not only in South Africa, I think we see it in many countries in the world, and we certainly see it here in the United States, where depending on your socioeconomic status, even if we have very difficult immigration regimes, if you are very wealthy, you're able, sorry, that's Siri on its own is listening to me, and So I think my response is yes, we do see that happening. Certainly, I don't think it's right. Like I said, I also come from Greece, and I see that in Greece now with the collapse of the economy. All of the building and so much of the Greek land is now being sold to non-nationals because they can. And I don't have a solution to that, unfortunately. Personally, I believe that that's just going to continue from what we're seeing politically around the world, and including South Africa, unfortunately.
In other words, maybe when we talk about these institutions, there is a need for us to pay attention to the nature of the global economy. That a political economy of xenophobia or the political economy of human rights ought not to be ignored. That we are not talking only about legal institutions, but that these legal institutions ought to be seen in terms of the political economy as well.
That's an important point. Thank you very much for that. And it slightly answers the question that I left to the audience at the end. Because the law isn't enough, the courts aren't enough.
Well, the courts don't do anything on their own. So the ICC has an investigatory body that, for example, the courts in the U.S. lack. So our court system in this country has no power of inquisition like other courts might. It's left up to a prosecutor's office. So again, the ICC does both. Here they don't do that. So if we look at heavy lifting being done by the courts in South Africa, does the court have the power to reach out to deal with civil unrest? Or is there a separation of powers so that it's not not my job, and it's the job of the executive branch or the law enforcement branch to investigate and prosecute? The courts just sit there and wait with an empty courthouse. So the ICC doesn't do that. But we do that here. What's the organization of the institutions in South Africa?
Essentially, so the reason why I was highlighting the courts is the point overall is that we have these legal frameworks and these laws, but they're not being applied to migrants. So in the end, after sort of those rights aren't being applied and it becomes a case that does reach the court, then the courts, can get involved. The court can't enforce. I mean, it can say, it rules, and it frequently does rule that the Department of Home Affairs has to do so and so and so within so many days. But the Department of Home Affairs just doesn't do that. It doesn't respond. And it doesn't take any of those recommendations, along with recommendations with the courts from the South African Human Rights Commission, whose reports I had access to do my review of the legal framework and the applicability. So, and that's the real problem now. And that's the real question is, what's happening when we do get these court rulings that do actually end up to the Constitutional Court, and they rule in this way in favor of migrants, and yet still they don't see their rights realized?
Well, who's there to protect their rights? I mean, sometimes rights are literally protected by another person, whether they're in a uniform, they have a large stick, they have a weapon, and they stand between a mob and an oppressed person.
Well, the problem is that those people standing between, especially the police, are in many times part of the problem.
Right.
Yeah. And then when they do attempt to assist in instances, and many times it's the opposite. Many times we see the victims being arrested because they'll be arrested for lack of documentation, for example, even though their home or their shop has just been looted. So it's law enforcement overall that's part of the problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
I can confirm that. I was just going to say how timely and amazing this is, and I know I walked in a little late, but I made a documentary, and one of the families that we feature actually is a Congolese family. They were migrants in South Africa. The father was a nurse. It was a xenophobic attack on their family that killed their 4-year-old son. And it was interesting because the result of that was a father that was grieving, going to the police department and then saying, speak to us in CAHSS, or we're not going to help you.
Yeah.
And it ended up that he was arrested and then thrown in jail and nothing was done. There was no justice for his family. They had to then flee and go to Greece, which is really interesting after it took them 4 years to get there. But I think it's just really timely and an incredible thing that they're doing. And this is really needed right now, especially just these, like what you mentioned, the xenophobic attacks in South Africa. It's real and it's happening.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's happening every day, actually. Thank you.
But that law enforcement element, I think, is definitely the corruption there is a problem and probably one of the roots of this issue, which I'm sure you've already.
And according to the 2002 Immigration Act, by law, whoever arrested the person had to provide a translator. So you're saying that clearly there was no translator, they wouldn't even talk to him.
That was going to be my question to you: is do you see like certain nations that are victimized more than others? I know that we talked about those bordering countries that are really affected, but like is the majority, Congolese people or Cameroonians that are fleeing, the current civil war, trying to go into South Africa? Is there certain groups, or is it kind of just everyone?
Yeah. And I will defer to you if you would like to add to that question as well. My answer is more depressing because I, while working in South Africa, I also did some consultancy work for the United Nations. So I would give monthly presentations. I was the team leader of this task team that they created on xenophobic violence. And I would have to go give monthly presentations to the UN and a lot of government officials in South Africa and international organizations about levels of violence. And unfortunately, when I would bring this issue up and I would sort of come to a question like yours, the answer from the United Nations is, well, actually, at the end of the day, it's a lot less bad in South Africa than it is in other countries. So that's kind of depressing, if you think about it. It's a lot worse in other areas. And the UN, since I'm talking about that, the United Nations are limited, let's not forget. And this whole conference is about the UN's Declaration on Human Rights. So they do have a power in the sense of shaming more so, I can say, in this regard. But we cannot forget that the United Nations are also guests in any country that they're in. And they're a guest in South Africa, in Pretoria, and they are also limited in what they can say and what they can do as well. So we have to consider that, please.
That was a fantastic question you asked, and thank you for bringing out this report from the Congolese. By the way, the Nobel Prize was awarded jointly to a Congolese and a lady from the Middle East for their fight against sexual violence, and that is to be noted. Who are those who are most targeted? The South Africans will target those who really are perceived as being better positioned and better placed in what Dr. Conte was explaining, to somehow take over some of the economy. Nigerians are regularly targeted, but the Nigerian authorities really were in a tit for tat against the South Africans in Abuja, because they told the South Africans, if you continue to do this to our people, we will react very, very strongly. And that seems to have stopped. So the Nigerians, they speak English, they are very good traders and so on. They are everything the South Africans are not. Somalis are also regularly targeted, because Somalis are extraordinary people, good traders, they know how to keep a shop and so on. They come from a very old tradition and so on, and the South Africans will actually target them for all kinds of reasons. And then you have people from the neighboring countries. The South Africans seem to be, they tend to believe that these people are stealing their jobs. Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, but there are all kinds of cultural undertones into this. But at the end of the day, I think that the South African, the finger should be pointed at the South African authorities, because they do not react in police stations and other instances simply because there is a narrative that continues to somehow preempt the upcoming force of very aggressive political movements, EFF and so on, but also because they want to keep on telling the people that if you don't have the housing, if you don't have this yet, if you have not yet succeeded in the restoration of the economy and so on, it may be because of the foreigners. And that is very, very dangerous. And I believe that the targeting of some of these foreigners is not only unfair, but it actually does not help the South Africans, because there are clearly important sectors of the society where South Africans are not strong. They don't have a civil service, civil society, or people at the medium and lower level of the economic sector who can actually sustain the extraordinary potential of South Africa. This is a case where I believe migration will be an asset for South Africa.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely it will be an asset. There are, like I mentioned earlier, there are major skill shortages in the country, which could easily be filled by people, especially in Nigeria and other countries, that are better educated, because you made the good point earlier that South Africans, I think, like Americans, they think they're exceptional in many ways. And that's not the case in South Africa with regards to their skills. The levels of education are lower, actually, than many other countries. And they do lack a lot of skills. And just to close, building on the points that you made just now, when you get that kind of xenophobic message from government officials, okay, coming not from the president in the case of South Africa, thankfully, but from high-level government officials, from the head of police, saying that it's migrants' fault that we lack jobs here, it's migrants' fault that we have such high violent crime levels in the country, then of course that's gonna affect what citizens believe, and certainly, without a doubt, it affects the high levels of xenophobic sentiment that continue, unfortunately, in the country.
But
Thank
again, this is the era of hyper-nationalism.
Yeah.
It is the era of populism.
Mm-hmm.
It is the era of all what people fought against in 1945, etc. So where does this take us?
I think that it means that we have a really big fight ahead of us, and we have a really long road ahead of us. I think that's where it takes us, in short, because I think we've gone over time quite a bit. Thank you.
Documentary that we're about to